Once you've gone through testing, so you've written out your sequence, you've done it yourself, you've marked it, and you know that it makes sense, now you need to think about your modifications and your options. In each class, you'll probably notice that there are a few poses that are a little bit harder than others. So anytime you have a pose that you think is a little bit more advanced, either because it requires a lot of strength, a lot of flexibility, or a lot of balance, you want to think of a modification for that pose to get ready to give to your students. You also want to think of poses that require or put a lot of pressure on joints. So sometimes I've noticed for myself when I'm teaching classes, the poses I need to give options and modifications for aren't necessarily super hard poses. It's not always my peak pose or my advanced pose. Sometimes it's just a pose that puts a lot of pressure on joints. A good example for this is low lunge. A low lunge is a very beginner-friendly type of pose. However, it doesn't always work for someone's knees. So how would you modify a low lunge? It can be as simple as, letting students know that they can double up and fold up their mat and put it under their knee. You might tell students at the beginning of class that they might want to have a blanket somewhere close by at the top of their mat so that they can slide that under their knee and under their palms if they know that they have a lot of, wrist issues or just sensitivity in their joints. Or you can say, what's an alternative to a low lunge? I can do the same thing by coming down on my back and just pulling my knee into my chest. So really just go through your sequence and see if you can think of a few poses that you'll probably want to be prepared in offering an alternative. When you're thinking about a modification, you're just thinking about what's a different kind of pose that can achieve the same result without putting as much pressure on the joints or without demanding the same amount of strength, flexibility, or balance. Another simple example is tree pose. Tree pose is hard. It's hard to balance in tree. I always give the option for people to not have their leg all the way up to the inner thigh. Maybe they keep their toes down on the ground for this one. You don't have to close your eyes. You can keep your eyes open. You can bring your arms wherever it is that you'd like. Sometimes same with Warrior 3. Warrior 3 is really challenging, especially when you're doing the full expression of the pose, which includes reaching the arms up overhead so that you're really all lengthened out, all parallel to the ground. That's a lot. So I'll give people the option to do airplane arms to help with balance and to lessen the amount of strain on shoulders and upper back. You can also just keep your hands at your heart. You can also just keep the back toes touching on the mat. They don't have to be lifted all of the way up. So you want to think about what are the poses that you think might cause a hiccup in your class and just be ready with pose alternatives and modifications that you can give your students. Especially when it comes to teaching in studio settings, it's a little bit different for me when I'm teaching online because I get to really call out the level. I get to say, this is an advanced yoga class, or this is a beginner-friendly yoga class. So it's not as necessary for me to always give options because people kind of know what they're going into and getting into. However, this was really important, especially when I was teaching in studios, because a lot of studio classes will be kind of all levels and you'll really get a mix of lots of different kinds of people that show up. So whenever I was planning a class that I knew I would be teaching in studio and I never knew who would actually show up, I tried to imagine that in my class was a super advanced practitioner with more skill and experience than me, more flexibility, more strength, more stamina. They've been doing this for decades. Super advanced, able to do, handstands and all of that. And at the same time, I imagined that in that same class, I also had a student who had limited mobility, had never done yoga before, totally beginner with some range of motion and strength issues, for example. So how can I create a class that will be suitable for both of these people? Now, of course, this is challenging, okay? At the end of the day, you'll have to meet in the middle. You won't be able to cater to each person 100%. However, you can keep them in mind. So sometimes the thing with modifications and options, it's not necessarily always about making a pose easier. sometimes you're going to want to also honor the more advanced students and give them a little bit more intensity and a little bit more challenge in certain poses. So we're never trying to neglect the people that are actually in the room with us. So modifications really go both ways. You're asking yourself, how could I make a specific pose a little easier? And how could I up the intensity of this pose at the same time? Something else that's really important when you're teaching a public class, please, please, please teach to the people who are actually in front of you and be prepared to completely drop the plan that you've created if needed. Don't be so rigid with the sequence that you've prepared. It's happened to me before where I've gone to class and the people that were in the class, the sequence I had intended was just not suitable. We had to focus maybe on the basics a little more and go back to our fundamentals. You just have to roll with it. Teach to the actual people in front of you, not the people that you imagined when you were designing and sequencing your class. This is especially important when you're teaching in person. Again, online is kind of a different ballpark because, well, you don't really see the people, but really don't neglect the actual people who have paid to come to your class because you're trying to honor the sequence that you planned out. We really do need to be adaptable as teachers and be wise enough to know when to let stuff go and to kind of go in a different direction. And the longer you teach and the more experience you get and the more trainings you take, the easier that will be to just adapt and go with the flow. Another thing on modifications and options, listen to your students. They know their bodies, okay? When it came time, when I would go to a student and they'd say, oh, I'm having a problem with this issue, I would never right away recommend an alternative pose. 95% of the time before I do that, I'm going to ask them, what do you think would feel better? Most of the time, the student knows what they would like to do. Instead, they're just wanting permission. They don't want to be the only person in the group doing something different than the group. They don't know if that's okay. They just want validation from the teacher that, yes, totally honor your body, do what feels good to you. Go on your back. You don't have to do regular child's pose. You can go on your back and pull your knees to your chest. You don't have to do full splits. You can do another type of hamstring stretch. A lot of the times students know their bodies. They know their own injuries, also very important to keep in mind. You are not a doctor. You don't know everything. It's so okay to say, I'm sorry, I don't really know, but I'm going to get informed on that for next week. That's happened before. You're human. Never, ever, 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 ever give out medical advice. You can offer modifications, options, other poses that they might be interested in trying, and you can work with the student to troubleshoot. Ask the student, what do you think would feel good? And then maybe you try something, see if it works or not, and then maybe give some options and alternatives and see how it works and work through it. It's happened a few times where someone came and they said that they had an injury that I had never heard of. So, some kind of spine injury or some kind of tear, a term I was not familiar with, a condition I was not familiar with. So I was really honest. I'm not going to try to fake it because I'm trying to look like I know everything. I don't know everything. And I can cause more harm by trying to appear wiser and smarter than I actually am. People will appreciate your honesty and your integrity as a teacher where you say, I don't actually know a lot about that. Can you explain a little bit more? Or just saying, what normally works for you, or what do you know doesn't work for your body, so I can be on the lookout, and whenever we're doing poses like this, I'm going to go to you and I'm going to give you some alternatives. So don't be a doctor. Be super comfortable with saying, I'm not sure, and be really comfortable with empowering the students to do what feels right for them. They know their bodies. Right at the beginning of class, you can make it a point to say, if at any point something does not feel right, my suggestions, I'm trying to think, what is the exact verbiage I've used? I think I've said, listen to your body first, or what's most important is how you feel in your body. My instructions come second, right? So yes, I want you to follow my instructions because I'm trying my best to keep you safe and to get you in the pose. But at the end of the day, you know your body best, and you need to listen to that first before you even think about listening to me. So really from the get-go, as you start your class, if you can get students in that mindset and to let them know it's totally okay with you if they choose to do a different pose at any time, a pose that is different than what you are teaching, you totally allow that in your class. I highly recommend doing that. I want to encourage you guys to not be micromanagers of your students, okay? Let go of control. It's okay if people are doing slightly different things in the room. It doesn't all have to look the same. Let go of the plan from time to time. Let students empower themselves by exploring and being curious and checking out to see what goes and works well for them. And at the same time, be prepared enough when you've written out your sequence, have, a few ideas of options, modifications, and alternatives that you can suggest, especially when you're thinking of the poses that are a little bit more challenging, demand a little bit more strength, flexibility, and balance. So keep that in the back of your mind and always ask yourself, here's another thing I should have mentioned, can I use a prop here? This is such an easy way to offer modifications and options. Sometimes the pose is fine, you just need a couple blocks, or you just need a strap, or you just need a bolster, or you just need a blanket, right? So use your props for your benefit. When you're thinking, don't think you have to reinvent the wheel all the time. Sometimes you just need to add a prop to the pose, and all of a sudden it's accessible to all levels in the group. And before we wrap up, I really just want to drive the point home. When you're offering modifications of poses to students, it doesn't have to be super complicated. You're really just trying to answer the question, what's a different pose that accomplishes the same thing? So for example, if you're working on back bends and you're trying to get students into wheel pose might not be suitable for every student in class. So what's an easier option? Bridge. Get people into bridge. Same thing with upward dog. Upward dog can be too much. Instead, give people the option of doing cobra pose or even sphinx pose. So it really doesn't have to be super complicated. Just think of what is a pose that has a little bit less intensity. And the same way you can reverse it. If you're in your flow and you're getting students in bridge pose and you know that you have some students who would prefer and are ready to go into wheel pose, give them the option of trying it out. If you're working on your inversions and you're doing a really challenging class and you're giving people the option of kicking up into handstand, you don't have to. You can just keep them in their standing splits. And if standing splits is too much, you can just keep them in a warrior 3 pose. So there's always an alternative solution that you can suggest to people. Finally, with hip openers, I find those are the easiest to modify because you can either just modify them with the use of a prop or you can just flip the pose on its back. So again, we mentioned low lunge. If low lunge is too intense, either because it hurts for some reason or it's too much pressure on the knees, you can use blocks under the palms, you can put a bolster under the thigh, or you can just flip the pose on its back and just pull the knee into the chest. Same thing with pigeon pose. Pigeon pose is very intense. This is one that I often have to modify for students, either by putting a block or a bolster under the hips so that they're elevated a little bit more, or flipping the pose on its back and doing reclined pigeon pose. So keep modifications in mind as you're planning your sequence and writing things out. Remember to empower the students to check in with themselves and give them permission to do something else if one of the poses don't work. Be ready to let go of your plan and teach to the students who are actually in front of you. And when you're writing out your sequence, just imagine, what if I have someone super beginner and super advanced? How can I create a class that meets all of their needs and still create a sequence that is safe, smart, and meaningful? So I hope you found this helpful. And next, we're going to talk all about cueing, something I really enjoy.